Okay, apparently my mic was hot that whole time, so you could hear me typing away. Anyway, sorry about that. Hi, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where in the world you happen to be. My name is Christopher Harrison. I apologize for the slight delay in getting started. There's always just like a lot of little odds and ends that need to be done before you go live with streaming, and invariably I will forget about one of them. So I had forgotten to go in and set up the title inside of Twitch. So anyway, hi. Let's go ahead and get rolling here. My name is Christopher Harrison. I'm a senior program manager inside of Cloud and AI. I'm a web developer at heart, and my main focus these days is to help make it easier for students to get up and running on Azure. And towards that end, that actually sort of leads us perfectly into one of the most popular forms of cloud computing these days, and that's going to be serverless. And so what I want to do over about the next 58 minutes is to introduce the concepts of serverless, talk about Azure Functions, and how they can fit into what it is that you're building with whatever it is that that you happen to be doing. Now, I do want to mention the fact that we are live here, so please feel free to ask all the questions that you want. This is exactly what I am here for. And also towards that end, it does mean at some point that things might not go perfect, that I might make some form of a mistake coding wise, or who knows. That's going to go along the way. So I ask right up front for your forgiveness. Not so much if, but when that happens. Mistakes happen. So anyway, let's go ahead and introduce the concept of serverless computing and see where this is going to fit into the grand scheme of things. So first of all, let's go ahead and define some terms. What is serverless computing? And if you're anything like me, and I know I am, if I'm looking for an approachable explanation or definition of something, I will frequently go straight to Wikipedia. That, say what you will about Wikipedia, and there's certainly, some bad things that you could potentially say. I love Wikipedia because what I find quite frequently is it will take really complex topics and break it down into something that's much more consumable for the average human. And so I go to Wikipedia constantly. And so this is Wikipedia's definition of serverless computing. So according to Wikipedia, serverless computing is a cloud computing execution model in which the cloud provider runs the server and dynamically manages the allocation of machine resources. So let's go ahead and start to break this down just a little bit here, and hopefully start to dig a little bit deeper into the concepts of serverless. And actually, I'm gonna go back to that Wikipedia slide here real quick. So the first thing that I want to highlight, the first thing that I want to call out on this slide is the fact that there is going to be a server. That you'll notice right there, it says an execution model in which the cloud provider runs the server. So serverless in and of itself is a bit of a misnomer, that there's always a server. Even if you say serverless, there's always a server, which makes logical sense because, after all, what's going to happen here is we're going to execute some bit of code, and at least as of 4:06 p.m. Pacific Daylight Time on August 11th, 2020, the only way that we can do this is to have a server. So there's always going to be a server. The catch here, though, is the fact that it's going to be somebody else's server. It's actually going to be somebody else that's managing everything. That if you've seen that joke t-shirt of there is no cloud, it's only somebody else's computer, it's sort of that same concept here, that there's still going to be a server. But what's going to be different is that last sentence fragment there dynamically manages the allocation of machine resources. So when we're talking about serverless, we then are not responsible for managing any form of the server. So we don't have to worry, for example, about things like containers. I love containers. I'm a huge fan of Docker, but at the end of the day, as wonderful as Docker is, there's still some level of management that needs to be done to get that system up and running. And then, of course, when we start to get into the higher levels of things like VMs or actual physical servers, obviously there's a lot of complexity in managing those, especially when it comes time to handle scale, especially when it comes time to cost. And this is really one of the biggest challenges that we face, is because sometimes we're going to know roughly how much compute power we're going to need. We're going to know roughly how many servers we're going to need. We're going to know roughly what the architecture is going to look like. But there are going to be times when we don't really have a clue. Or there are also going to be times where maybe we just don't want to invest the time, the money, and the resources into trying to figure all of that out. And this is where serverless shines. Because what I can do is I can write my code. I can write my apps. I can say, hey, this is what I need to have done, and then deploy it out. And then now I don't have to worry about anything else. So I don't have to worry about provisioning servers. I don't have to worry about scaling. And also, in a lot of scenarios, I don't necessarily have to worry about a huge surprise bill, or maybe, depending on what it is that you're doing, a bill at all. So serverless really can be a best of a lot of different worlds, that it can be much more cost effective, it can give me scaling, and it can give me the ability to not have to think about that architecture, that I can just focus on my code and then away I go from there. So there's a question in the chat here from, and forgive me if I mispronounce the name, Depeche asked the question, is this the same like Google Firebase? So Google Firebase is a collection of various services that will allow you to do things like authentication, to do deployment of mobile apps, to have a database, etc. And as part of that, they have a serverless implementation as well. I want to say that they call it Functions. Please don't quote me on that. I'm terrible with naming of things. So I know they've got, Google Cloud Compute that's like part of it, but it effectively is the same thing, because in both of those scenarios, it is going to be serverless computing. That what I'm going to do is I'm going to write my little components that need to run somewhere inside the cloud. I'm going to push them out and then not have to worry about them from there. So it's very similar to a component of Firebase, yes. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about why serverless. So we already mentioned a lot of these different components. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here, but again, full abstraction of servers. I focus on my code. I don't have to think about where it's going to run. I just write my code. You're also going to notice instant event-driven scalability. So if you create an app, especially let's say, for example, that this is going to be supporting an IoT implementation. So I'm getting tons of data. Well, there could very well be a spike for whatever reason that I'm not expecting, that maybe there's a faulty sensor somewhere. And so now I'm just getting an overload of data. And I need to make sure that my application can automatically scale to that. and then automatically be able to scale back down into nothing as needed. And so serverless compute can do exactly that. And then finally, last but not least, is pay per use. That one of the other big challenges that a lot of applications face is they will provision all of these various VMs, be it in the cloud or otherwise. They're paying all of this money, and they're only seeing a fraction of the usage the majority of the time. So rather than paying for all of those VMs when we're not using it, with serverless compute, with Azure Functions, what we're going to be able to do is to pay for just what it is that we're using and nothing else. So what are some common scenarios that exist for functions? And they give you a whole list right here, and I'm not going to go through each one of these, but there's two in particular that I want to call out. And the first is going to be web application backends. When you're creating a single page application, let's say that you're using React, let's say that you're using Angular, what you're going to need is some back end set of services that can help power that app. And one common way to do this would be to deploy out a full-blown web server. But the catch with doing that is that a lot of times that's going to be way too much overhead, when all that I need is a series of small little services, microservices if you will, that will allow me to string together all of the various operations that I'm going to need to make this magic happen. And so as a result, an Azure function or serverless compute can be a perfect backend for web apps. Another great example for functions, and this is sort of going to be the one that I'm going to simulate here in my second demo, is for real-time file processing. So I remember hearing an interview on a podcast, and this was a good number of years ago, from a newspaper in the Chicago area, and I can't remember exactly which one it was, but that's sort of irrelevant. So the newspaper gets thousands and thousands and thousands of images on a given day. And those images will ebb and flow as far as the number goes, depending on the day and depending on what it is that's going on in the world. That if there's a big news story, obviously they're going to get a lot more pictures. If it's a slow news day, they're going to get far fewer pictures that are going to be coming through. And so what they need, if they're going to be processing all of those, is they're going to need a solution that's going to be able to automatically scale up and scale down without having to worry about how to exactly architect that. Because after all, you really don't know what kind of a day it's going to be. You really don't know how many pictures you're going to wind up getting in. And then on top of that, what they're really trying to do with all of those pictures is automatically create all of the different sizes and resolutions and everything else that they're going to need. So that way, when it's going to display on a website, when it's going to display on the mobile version of that website, when it's going to display inside of the mobile app, or for those of us that are old enough to still read print newspapers, they're going to need a version of the picture that's going to be printable inside of a print newspaper. So one image needs to be converted into a dozen different versions, just depending on where the targets for that image are going to wind up being. So again, scaling here is going to become a thing, especially if one day we decide that we're going to set up a new template where now all of a sudden we need a brand new size that's going to be available. So just a couple of possible scenarios that are going to that are going to be available. And this is eventually where I'm going to be building towards. So in our scenario, I'm going to generate some thumbnails. I'm going to rely on Azure Cognitive Services to be able to do this. I'm also going to be relying on Azure Blob Storage to do this as well. And so my requirement is that I want this to run automatically when an image is added to blob storage. I want to be able to scale this because I don't know how many images I'm going to get at any given time. And of course, I want to be able to pay only for what it is that I'm going to be using. So this is where I'm going to be driving towards. If we're going to get started, if you're curious about everything it is that you're going to need, there's everything to get started. So let me actually back up here for just a moment. So when we're talking about building something for serverless, when we're talking about building something for Azure Functions, we of course want to be able to write our code, be able to run that and debug all of that locally. That if I constantly have to deploy out to the cloud just to test things, that's not going to be a good scenario. So when it comes time to get started in using our Azure Functions, the first thing that we're going to want to make sure that we have is the appropriate emulator installed locally. And there's two things that you're going to need for this. The first thing that you're going to need is you will need Node.js, specifically either the active or the long-term support version, which as of the time of this broadcast is going to be 12 and 10 respectively. You're also going to need to install the Azure Functions core tools, which will actually then emulate Azure Functions for you. You can install those just like you would install most other components on your operating system of choice. And then if you're going to be using Visual Studio Code, because why wouldn't you, there's going to be two little components that you're going to need on there. And that's going to be the Python extension and the Azure Functions extension. And I want to highlight the fact that if I bring up the documentation here for Azure Functions, just click on that and say, go to documentation. When you go into create your first of whatever it is, so if I go into create my first on Python, you'll notice that it will walk you through all of that right there. So you don't have to memorize everything that was on that slide. You can just go ahead and walk through that quick start. And it does a really nice job of showing off everything that you might need to know about getting up and running with Azure Functions. Okay. So with that, let's go ahead and start creating our first Azure function. Now, I'm going to highlight the fact that you're going to notice I'm actually not going to go to Azure yet. That I'm a developer. And so step one for starting any new application is to fire up your code editor of choice and to start writing code. I don't want to go create server resources first. I want to create my code. I want to start playing. I want to start making sure that everything works. This is where I want to start. So this is now where I am going to start exactly here. Now, I've already got the appropriate components installed. So I'm going to click on the Azure button right here. And then what you're going to notice right up towards the very top of that Azure button, and this is the Azure Functions plugin for Visual Studio Code that we're seeing right here, what you're going to notice is that there's a little icon right here that says Create Function. There's also a little icon right here that says Create New Project. Create New Project is effectively a folder that's going to hold all of my different functions. So I'm going to start with Create New Project. It's going to ask me, all right, select the folder, and I'm just going to choose the current one right here. And then it's going to say, all right, choose your language, and I'm going to choose Python. And then it's going to say, all right, well, choose the Python interpreter, and I'm going to choose 3.8. And then it's going to ask, okay, well, what template do you want to use? Now, these templates, sort of as you might expect, are going to be just a little bit of boilerplate code that you can take advantage of for creating your functions. You absolutely don't have to depend on these at all, but what I like about them for me personally is they give me like just enough of the back-end plumbing that I don't want to set up without, and this is my problem with using a lot of templates, without just overwhelming me with a whole bunch of stuff that I just need to go in and delete. So it walks, I think, kind of that real nice fine line between the two. So I'm going to choose an HTTP trigger. I'll talk more about triggers and bindings and all of that in a couple of moments. But for an HTTP trigger, basically what this is going to be is it's going to be a lot like setting up a web service or a REST endpoint. That the way that this is going to get executed is when I navigate to a particular route, when I navigate to a particular URL. Now it's going to ask me for the name. I'm going to say hello world, hit enter. It's going to ask me for the authorization level. I'm going to choose anonymous. And now it's going to go ahead and create all of the necessary components. So let's take a look at what it is that it's set up for us. So the first thing that it's set up, if I open up my requirements.txt file, is the Python package that we're going to need to run our Azure Functions. It's creatively called Azure.Functions, or Azure-Functions rather. So it's already got that. And in fact, you'll even notice that it gives me a copy of a venv folder automatically. So it's already set up a virtual environment for Python. So following best practices, always wonderful there. And it's already just given me the virtual environment. So I don't even need to run a pip install here. It's already got it. It's all set and ready to go. The next file that it's created here is this little thing called host.json file. And what you're going to notice with our host.json is it's just setting up a couple of different odds and ends, like the version of functions that you want to use, so be it version 2, version 3, whatever it is that you might want, whether or not we're going to be setting up anything with application insights, etc. For the most part, you can basically just let that file sit in the background. That you're going to notice that I opened it, and now I'm just going to go ahead and close it. The func_ignore file is very simple, similar to the gitignore file. This is simply going to highlight all of the different files that we're not going to upload when we go to push our function up to the cloud. The big one inside of here that I'm going to highlight is this local.settings.json. And this local.settings.json is where I can go in and set different keys and make sure that I don't accidentally commit these into GitHub. That your security tip for the day is that, generally speaking, publishing keys, usernames and passwords as clear text into a publicly available website, not a good idea. Just a little tip from me to you. Okay, let's go in and take a look though at the actual function that was created. So the two core files that we want to be familiar with are going to be our function.json file and our init.py file. So our function.json file is going to be the configuration for this specific function. Now, one big thing to keep in mind when you're creating functions is effectively what we're creating is microservices. So little components. And so as a result, each one of these function JSON files is going to describe the associated code that's going to go with it, in our case inside of that init.py file. Now, the two items that we're going to have inside of here are going to be the binding, specifically the trigger. So this is going to be what's going to cause this to execute, which in my case is going to be an HTTP trigger, which means that I'm going to have to go to whatever the website is, /hello world in my case. So that's going to be what's going to trigger this. You're also going to notice, very similar to really any web service, that we can indicate the methods or verbs that are available. So in our case, get and post. And then last but not least, what you're going to notice is the output, whatever it is that we're going to emit. So in our case, we're going to emit HTTP. So we're just going to return some text or JSON or blob data or whatever it is that it might be. Okay. Now the code sits here. And so our code is going to be, whoops, that was not what I wanted to move. There we go. The code is going to be, of course, what it is that is going to execute. This is the star of the show here. So what you're going to notice is, first of all, the fact that this is a normal Python file. So our init.py is where we're going to create a module. This is what's going to get executed first. And Azure is going to be hard-coded to go look for this main function inside of init.py. You do have the ability to go in and change this. So if you don't want it to look inside of init.py, if you don't want it to look for main, you can go in and change that. But in our case, we're going to go ahead and leave that as is. The next thing that you're going to notice is we're going to utilize the type hints capability inside of Python. This is a relatively new addition to Python, and I am a huge fan of it. That as much as I do love Python, one of the biggest problems is the fact that it is weakly typed, meaning that while the variables will of course maintain the type, so when I set it to be a string or I set it to be a number or I set it to be a data set or whatever it is that it happens to be, my runtime is going to know, oh, okay, that's the data type. But the problem is the fact that you could always reassign that variable to be literally anything it is that you might want at any moment. And so it's really hard, if not impossible, for development environments to know what it is that a variable is at any given time without running all of the code. That if I just simply set this up as just simply the parameter name, Python's not going to know what that data type is. So my data type hints are going to now give me autocomplete. It's now going to give me IntelliSense. It's now going to be able to help me out here. So while technically they're not needed, it's certainly going to make your life a whole lot easier if you take advantage of it. And I just saw that I went red. It looks like I'm back again. Okay. Cool. Am I back? Is anybody out there? I'm getting lonely. Say hi. We're live here. Hi. Okay, cool. There we go. Lurking while eating. I totally get that. Okay, and it looks like I'm back online again. Fantastic. Cool. All right. So yeah, so those are our type hints. Perfect. Okay. So now what you're going to notice inside of here is that we're going to do just a little bit of logging. When I'm running this locally, this will print out to our console. And when we're running this inside of Azure, this will then print out to the log behind the scenes. And now I'm just going to wave hi to everybody that's saying hi. Hi. Okay. Now what you're going to notice is that request object is going to be very familiar. Whoops, rec. There's my Q key. This is going to be very familiar to you if you've done web development in the past. And this is very much by design, that one of the big things about Azure Functions is that it does try, when possible, to resemble doing normal web development. And so, for example, if I want to go in and I want to find the method that was used, I want to go grab the parameters, I want to get the body, I want to get the JSON, whatever it is that, that I might want to do, I'm going to have all of those available to me. So for our hello world that's going to be set up here, there's going to be one parameter that's going to be of type name. And we can pass this in with the body, or we can pass this in by using a query string parameter. If it's passed in via the body, then what we're going to do is we're just going to go grab the JSON. If it's not, then we're going to go ahead and whoops, nope, sorry, strike that, reverse it. What we're going to do is we're going to go grab whatever it was that was passed in as JSON. So our request object will automatically do that for us, and it's then going to give that back to us as a JSON object, and then we'll be able to go ahead and get the name off of it. If it wasn't passed in with the body, then we're going to get it off of the query string. I feel like I need to try that all over again because I don't think I explained that really well. So deep breath, take two, here we go. All right. This is built to accept a parameter in one of two ways, either on the query string or inside of the body. If we pass it in via the query string, then we're going to be able to go grab this as a normal parameter. We'll just simply say request parameters get, and then whatever the name happens to be. If, however, it was passed in via the body, that gets sent up in a different mechanism, and as a result is available inside of a different collection. It's going to be available inside of the body itself. It's going to be available via JSON. So what we're going to do is we're going to say, hey, go give me the JSON object. And then assuming that there's something there, then we're going to go ahead and grab the name. If it turns out that we couldn't find it in the query string or that we couldn't find it in the body, then we're going to go ahead and flag an error message. If it turns out that we were able to find it, then we're going to print back out hello name. So hopefully that brought it together a bit better than I did the first time. Exactly, yeah, Brett puts it really well because the function has get and post, so it's going to check them both. We look at the query string first, see if it's there. If it's not, then we'll move on and look to see if it's inside the body and sent up via post. You could also go in, like there's a couple of other ways that we could have managed this, that on our function JSON, we could say, hey, only send it up via get and just get rid of post, do it that way. Or another way that we could go in and do this is instead we could go ahead and have simply looked rec.method and look to see if it was get or post that way. And that would be the other way that we could indicate it. So a couple of different ways that we could have done it. This is the way that that set it up, and that's fantastic. Okay, cool. So now that I've got that built, I'm going to go ahead and hit the little play button here. This will now go ahead and hopefully start my Azure function. It decided not to. Okay, let me do an F5 here. There we go. Okay, my play button should have worked. Anyway, so I hit F5. And what you're going to notice down below inside of the terminal window is a whole bunch of things that went on behind the scenes to start my local instance of functions running. So I now have my own local serverless server sitting right here that I can go ahead and test off of. What you're also going to notice if I scroll back up is that right here, it's going to show me the various HTTP functions, the ones that I could navigate to directly to go ahead and execute. So I'm going to control click to bring up that little link. give me just a second as I move it into the right window because it always puts it into the wrong spot for me, and then switch screens. And now what you're going to notice is the fact that I am at 127.0.0.1, 7072 to access it, whack API, whack hello world. You'll notice that it says please pass a name in the query string or the request body. I'm going to update this to now say name equals Christopher, hit enter, and voila, it now says hello Christopher. And now we've got our hello world with Azure Functions. It's now an official presentation demo, coding demo, because we did hello world. There was much rejoicing. Yay. Okay, so what we did here is we created our first function, and we set up this function as an HTTP request. Could also be a webhook to respond to something happening, say, in GitHub or other services that have the ability to be able to pass something out into our service. So this is now exactly what we've got. And of course, it's just running here locally on my server. Well, now I want to be able to deploy that out. So let's go ahead and take a look at how we could go ahead and deploy that out. All right, and let me make sure that that's ended. It is. Okay, cool. All right. So now let me come back over here to my little Azure button here. And what you're going to notice is that it lists all of my functions here, and I can go in and start to work with them. But you're also going to notice right here that I've got a little spot that says deploy to Azure Functions. And so now it's going to ask me, hey, go ahead and select a function app inside of Azure. So I'm going to go ahead and just choose to create a brand new function app. It's going to ask me for the name, and I'm going to say Geek Trainer presentation. That looks good. Hit enter. Choose my runtime stack, 3.8. Choose the location, and I'm going to choose West US 2. One thing that I always like to highlight about locations is that typically it doesn't matter where you deploy it to as far as functionality goes, but if you are going to have this function use other Azure resources, you want to make sure that everything's inside of the same location. And I just realized that I had the wrong screen up that entire time. All right, let me put up the right screen. Let's try this over again. Okay, back on the right screen, back inside Visual Studio Code. So let's try this again. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to click on that little button right up here that says Deploy Function App. And I'm going to say Create New Function App in Azure. Click on that. Give it a name. Geek Trainer Presentation. And then hit Enter. Now it's going to ask me my runtime stack. Hit that. And now it's going to ask me my location. And then I'm going to choose West US 2. And now it's going to go ahead and provision and deploy all of this automatically for me. So Dev Bambo asks the question, is the web backend in Python? So my code is going to be running in Python. Now, where my code is actually going to be running is going to be inside of a container that's going to be wholly managed by Azure. So I don't need to worry about it. It's automatically going to run and handle everything automatically for me and be able to run all of my Python code. Okay. Now, while that's finishing deploying here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring up my, my browser here. So this is my copy of Azure. And what you're going to notice, this right here, this Geek Trainer presentation, this was not here when we started. Nothing up my sleeves except for my arms. And if I click on this, now what we're going to see is I've got my application insights. I've got a little storage account, and then eventually here, it's going to finish creating that, that function, and finish deploying it out. Yeah, there we go. So there is my Geek Trainer presentation. There is that Azure function. And if I click on this, then what you're going to notice is that it gives me that little URL. And if I click on this, and I now go to whack API whack hello world, that, give it just a second here to finish building. Give me an opportunity to take a sip of water. No, it's okay. That's an expected fail. We're all good. Just takes it a moment. It takes just long enough to make you nervous. That's how long any deployment takes. Okay. Come on. Yeah, it's still sitting there. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's directly proportional to the number of people that are watching. More people that are watching, slower it goes. It's like a pot of water. Okay. All right, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to just leave that there for the time being. I'm actually just going to go back to my slides here. This will actually kind of work out perfect because it will give me the opportunity to talk a little bit about the server side and all of that. So a couple of real quick local dev tips. So number one is securing keys. So there is going to be that local settings.json file that you can use to store all of your keys. Absolutely, the way to do it. And what you're also going to notice is that my tooling inside of Visual Studio Code will actually give me the ability to automatically push up all of those settings to make sure that they're properly pushed up into Azure as well. If you are going to be doing a lot of work with Azure Storage, it's recommended that you use an emulator. That's where Azurite comes into play. And so you can actually just go do a real quick search for Azurite emulator, install that, and there's actually an extension for Visual Studio Code that will do that for you as well. And same thing with Cosmos. Now, the reason that I'm highlighting Azure Storage and Cosmos is because these are two very common components of function-based apps. And you're also going to notice that there's going to be bindings that will be available to those, which we're going to highlight in just a moment. So there's a question if this channel is good for somebody who's just getting into coding from Swifty. The answer to that is 100% yes. That as Brett highlights, and thank you for answering that, Brett. That was perfect. That yeah, there's a wide range of topics that are available, and a wide variety of presenters as well. Okay. Let me see. Did this finish deploying? It still hasn't finished deploying. All right. Well, we'll keep talking to slides then. Okay. The next thing that I want to call out here is triggers. So a trigger is anything that's going to cause a function to execute. Now, the first type that we took a look at is the HTTP or webhook. And so this is basically going to be an on-demand type of function. So I want to be able to call this on demand. There we go. And so this would be great for, again, like webhooks, something that happens that I can configure it to call out to an API. This is also great for backend for single page applications and the like. But one big use for functions is in response to some form of an event. So a message being dropped into a queue, a file being uploaded into blob storage, something happening with IoT, streaming out new data, etc. So what you're going to notice with functions is that there's multiple triggers where I can go ahead and bind this up inside of Azure and say, hey, when you see this taking place, I want you to execute this function. And that's exactly what I'm going to demo here in just a couple of moments. The other thing that I want to highlight is that we can also ease our development by taking advantage of bindings. So with a binding, what I can do is say, hey, I know that I'm going to be getting this type of input from Azure, or I know that I'm going to be writing this type of output to Azure. How can I go ahead and do that? And this is where bindings can go ahead and come into play. What's really nice about bindings is the fact that it will also then align with my key management inside of local settings, because I'm always going to need either a connection string or username and password or anything like that. And what will happen when I set up the binding is it will go, hey, where do you want me to connect to? What do you want me to work with? And then it will then go ahead and update that local settings.json. So that way I don't accidentally publish this out into source control, which again, generally speaking, is going to be a bad idea. All right. Now I'm going to get in and do the demo of the binding here in just a moment. My deploy is still going. I don't know why this is taking it so long. That's crazy. I've never seen it take this long. Yeah, it's still going. I'm worried about, you know what? I'm just going to do it. All right, give me just a second here. Talk amongst yourselves. I'll give you a topic. The Industrial Revolution was neither industrial nor revolution. Discuss. Okay, I just canceled out of that. Let me try this again real quick. Bloop, bloop. Geek trainer presentation. Deploy. This should not take it that long. Come on. Huh. Okay. All right. I'm just going to read the question here real quick. Oh, yeah. Tardy Gravy asked a question about best practice for deploying an app and function. Actually, you know what? Let me spend a second with that. So one big thing about Azure Functions is the fact that this is based on top of app services. App services, for those of you who are not familiar, is the web hosting platform that's available on Azure. And it's based on it so tightly, in fact, that you could actually, if you wanted to, just set up a full-blown app service to run your functions. I really typically wouldn't recommend that, but you could absolutely go ahead and do that if you so desired. Again, not typically a recommended way to do it, but you could do it. And so as a result, the different components and features that you come to expect inside of app services, a lot of those are going to be available inside of functions as well. And one of those, and this is what Brett called out, and thank you for that fantastic response, Brett, is deployment slots. Now, because of the level that I chose here, which was the most basic level, which by the way is also the free level as well, I don't have deployment slots available to me, but if I was using a higher level, I'd have them here. And these then basically act like duplicated versions. And so I could actually go ahead and use this one here as staging, deploy out to this, and then when I go, hey, I'm now ready to bring staging to live, I can bring it live. And then if I realize, oh, wait a minute, something's broken, I could actually very easily flip it back. And you can do that near instantaneously, or something known as hot swapping. It's also worth highlighting while I'm here this little thing called configuration and on my app settings. And my app settings are going to be available to me when I am using my process.env, or in other words, I'm using OS environmental variables. And to my application then, this looks just like environmental variables, so I can go in and just grab the values natively just like that. And then in turn, what you're also going to notice is that I could very easily then go in and update these anytime that I need to change the value. And I also want to highlight the fact that if you really need to get secure, that we even have this thing called Azure Key Vault that you can go ahead and use if you need to. Okay. Let me go ahead and do something with binding here real quick. Ah, that was not what I wanted you to do. Okay. I want this. I want this. I want that and that. Okay, there we go. All right. So let me go ahead and create a brand new function here. And I'm going to go with my Azure Blob Storage trigger. And it's going to ask me for a name. And I'm going to give this a name of thumbnail generator. Hit enter. And then it's going to say, all right, I need to know what Azure Blob Storage it is that you want to use. Now, one thing that's worth highlighting is when you create the function app service inside of Azure, it will automatically give you an Azure storage setup. And so you could go ahead and use this just like you would inside of any other Azure storage. Like it's just Azure storage. You typically, of course, would go off and create your own. For simplicity's sake, though, I'm going to go ahead and just use the one that's already provided here. So I'm going to say, all right, go ahead and grab that. It's going to ask me, okay, well, where do you want all the items to be placed? And I'm going to hit enter. And now let's go ahead and talk about what it is that, that we've done here. So what I've done is, let me open up my function JSON file. Is I've created a brand new function. And this function is now going to execute every single time that a new item is dropped into that storage location right there. And so it will just execute whatever's inside of this init.py. So in my case, it's just simply going to write out, hey, that we found this name and we found this length. Now, what I want to be able to do is I want to be able to generate thumbnails of every image that was uploaded. And I'm going to make my life a little bit easier here because we're almost out of time, and I'm going to just go copy and paste some pre-built code. It's typically not the way that I like to do things, but we're almost out of time, and I just want to make sure that, that I can get through this. Now, in my scenario, I want to generate thumbnails. Well, the catch about generating a thumbnail is I don't just simply want to make the image smaller, but I want to make sure that we're going to go grab the relevant portion of the image. This is where cognitive services comes into play. That with cognitive services, there's a built-in little function right here called generate thumbnail in stream that will be able to go find the appropriate portion of the image to generate a thumbnail from, and then automatically create that. And so now what I want to do is I want to output this back out into Azure Storage. So now this way, let's say I'm creating a web application. When somebody goes to access the image, then what's going to happen is they'll be able to now get a properly sized thumbnail and not the kind of common scenario where the entire image is sent down to the user, and then it's inside of the HTML that then resizes it. That's not what we want to have happen. Now, the main thing that I want you to focus in on is the fact that I'm just writing Python code. Yes, I'm using cognitive services. Yes, this is an Azure product, but you can really do whatever it is that you want inside of an Azure function, as long as it's just designed to do one little thing, which is exactly what it is that I'm doing right here. Now, the other thing that I want you to notice is I want to be able to output this back into blob storage. And so I'm going to come back over to my little thumbnail generator, and I'm going to say add a binding. I want an output binding. I want to go to Azure Blob Storage, and I'm going to give this a name of output. And my container here is going to be samples, work items, thumbnail. And then we'll go ahead and keep the same name, which is really cool. It's just going to keep the same name for me. Hit enter. We'll keep using that same storage. And now there is that all wired up. Now I am going to need to make sure that I've got the appropriate library for cognitive services. So let me go ahead and grab that. Boom, just like that. And can even go ahead and do a pip install to make sure that that's installed. And I'm also going to need to make sure that I've got the URL and the key here to be able to connect out. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add in those values as appropriate. So let me go grab the settings that I need. Let me copy and paste. There we go. Okay. And you're going to notice that I'm putting those inside of that local settings.json file. And it's also worth highlighting that with the built-in tools, that I've got the ability to encrypt them if I need to. I've got the ability to automatically upload them as well back into that same location. So I get a lot of great tooling with that local settings.json file. And so if I go ahead and I run this, Geek Trainer presentation. There we go. And I want my Storage Explorer. Okay, cool. So that's now running in the background. Let me go to my Storage Explorer. And if I open up all of my storage accounts here, chugga. Yeah, Brett, thank you so much for answering all of those questions in there. You get a gold star for the day. Thank you. Why? There we go. Okay. All right, in my blob containers. Okay, so what I'm going to do is, if we remember, which I don't, the name of the location, it was going to be samples work item. So I'm going to go ahead and create a brand new blob container that's going to be called that samples work items. And I'm going to go ahead and drag drop a picture onto that. to now get executed. So you're going to notice that this is now transferring behind the scenes. I'm going to switch over to code here. And what we should notice once this is finished uploading, yeah, you can already see that it's now already processed that item and it's executed. So if I scroll up in here, you're going to notice that it's now processed that. You're going to notice that it executed that little thumbnail generator. And if I go back over to my storage container and I refresh real quick on my blob containers, that I'm now going to have my thumbnails. I'm now going to have that thumbnail right there. And I could go ahead and download that and show that off. So that was not there 2 seconds ago. That was just created on the fly by our cool function. And so, boop-a-doo. Do you not have that ability? You don't. Just want an easy way to show this off. There we go. Let me go into browser. Yeah, so there is the thumbnail that was generated from the image. And if I open up the original image, go into my desktop here, and there is the original image. So you'll notice big image here, and then you're going to notice that there is the smaller image. And what you're also going to notice is that it was focused in on where it thought the most important part was of that. So yeah, that was our beloved Roscoe. He crossed the Rainbow Bridge about a year ago, but we still love him very much here. And so that was automatically set up by our Azure function. So the takeaway that hopefully you got from all of that is with a couple of clicks inside Visual Studio Code, what I was able to do is I was able to set up that little binding into Azure Storage, so that way every time that a new item is created, we could go ahead and process that and create a brand new item and send it back out. What I also want to highlight is the fact that we're able to just run code. So at the end of the day, what can functions do? They can do whatever it is that you might want them to be able to do. And then just to show that our function from before did in fact deploy, you're going to notice it finally made it. There it is there. I'll go ahead and say question mark name equals Christopher, hit enter, and voila, it has now deployed all of that out. And I could also, by the way, go ahead and deploy out the second function as well. So that's the takeaway that I hope you got from all of this. I apologize for the little bit of hiccup in trying to get things to deploy and work just a little bit faster for me. Of course, performance is always inversely directly proportional to the number of viewers, but we got it all done. There it all is. I think it's pretty cool. Hopefully you picked up a couple of things. And if you're curious more about some uses for functions, I would highlight the fact that we're going to have Jim Bennett come 9 a.m. tomorrow morning, all time specific. So 9 a.m. tomorrow morning, talking about IoT. And then 9 a.m. on Thursday morning, I'm going to be back online talking about one of my favorite things, which is Azure Static Web Apps, which actually uses functions quite heavily behind the scenes. The recording will be available over on youtube.com/Microsoft Reactor. I'll throw the link into the chat in just a couple of moments. I want to thank everybody for tuning in, and have a fantastic night. Thank you. Bye-bye.